This week, Senator Chuck Schumer threatened two Supreme Court justices. Imagine that, a world where our legislatures threaten Supreme Court justices, but he certainly did. At a rally, he said of Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch that if they continue down the path they were on as they're reviewing a case sitting currently before the Supreme Court, that they would not know what hit them. They would not know what hit them. Now, he's backed that up and he said, I didn't mean to threaten. That's not what I was trying to do. I was simply helping them to understand there would be some political fallout if they don't look at the abortion issue and the pro-choice movement the way that we did. Now, what's interesting about that for any observer of this whole story who is discerning at all is that Supreme Court justices are removed from the political process, so political fallout really shouldn't touch them. So whatever it was he meant to say and whatever it was he intended for them to hear when he threatened them, he's stepping back and saying, that's not what I meant, and we're now dealing with exactly what it was he was trying to say. But we look at that and man, the scene around that is a really odd scene. Chuck Schumer is standing and he's addressing a crowd at a pro-abortion rally. Now, this is not a pro-choice rally because if you listen to the audio of other speakers at this rally, they were certainly not pro-choice. They were pro-abortion to the point where they were cheering on those in the crowd who have had abortions. They're cheering on those who provide abortions and those who would continue to support legislation that is pro-abortion. And yet we have a legislature standing up and threatening those who are deciding these very important issues about abortion and its future in the states of the United States of America. There are a lot of questions that can be asked here, particularly those related to the separation of powers in our nation. We have various branches for a reason, and they keep each other accountable, and we're thankful for that. But when you have one branch threatening another branch, you have to ask what's happening. We could discuss that, but I would say this, that what's happening is really a smokescreen to a much larger issue. Why would Senator Schumer stand up and say what he said? Why would he threaten those who are currently sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States? Most of the time, threats are used when you run out of arguments. Have you ever seen two kids fight? This is exactly what happens. When you run out of good arguments, good reasons why something should or should not happen, what does that conversation typically devolve into, particularly with children? It devolves into accusations. It devolves into threats. It devolves into bullying. This is a problem that we have, right? I've got children and I see this happen all the time. I try to straighten them out and talk about evidence and fact and how we should actually have a discussion with one another. But when you begin to threaten someone else, it's because you've run out of arguments. It's also because, and I think this is the case that we saw unfold this week, because you're desperate. Abortion debate has been going on for many, many years. That's no surprise to anyone who would be watching or listening to this. It's an interesting debate because it goes back to really a fundamental question of a woman's right to choose, connected to the other fundamental question of when does life begin? So the first one is, how much do we believe that a woman has a right to choose what she does with her body? This is a question that's asked again and again and again. What do we believe about that? We could then ask the next question, what part of her body do we believe she has the right to control? Is it just hers or the one growing inside of her as well? These are questions that need to be answered. On the other side of the debate is this question of when does life begin? From where I sit, this is why there is so much desperation in the conversation about abortion right now. Both sides are getting desperate. Both sides are getting very, very upset about what they perceive to be the other side coming against their long-held belief. For many years, those who supported the idea of choice, abortion, have said things like this. Not only does a woman have a right to choose what to do with her body, but that child growing inside of her is not really a child. In fact, they would say, it's extremely difficult scientifically to demonstrate when exactly life begins. To many, this is a valid argument. Does life begin at conception, or does life begin when the first brain waves or the first heartbeat are detected? Does life begin when that fetus becomes viable outside of the womb? The question is, when does life begin? The proponents of abortion for many, many years have then gone on to say something like this: if we could just simply demonstrate scientifically when life begins, then we would be able to say this is when abortion should end. There is a line, and the line is just on the other side of that moment when we determine that life actually begins. This then gets into a question of how we define life and what exactly life means to us, but this has long been the argument. Now, most people would not disagree with the premise, at least, that a woman has a right to choose, as does a man, what to do with her body. And a man has a right to choose what he'll do with his body. We as individuals have free will, and we can exercise that free will to choose what we'll do with our own bodies. The question is not, does she have the right to decide what to do with her body, but what right does she have over the body growing within her? So again, it comes right back to the question of when does life begin? All of that has changed, really, in the very recent past. Even in the last few weeks, in the state of Virginia, a bill has been pushed forward that says something to the effect of this: if a fetus, if a child survives an abortion attempt, the doctor has no responsibility to then care for that child that has been born, in spite of the attempts of the doctor to take that child's life. In the United States Senate, a bill was proposed and voted on last week, the Born Alive Child Protection Act. This bill would have mandated that medical professionals would be required, not state by state, but across the nation by federal law, would have been required to provide care to a child born after a botched or ineffective abortion. Now, the Senate bill was in response to some of the state bills and legislation that's coming forward. It was a way to prevent those things from coming forward and coming to pass. Really, it was a way to say, look, a child born is a child that should be protected, a child that has rights, a child that we could all agree is alive. When does life begin? Well, we might argue about the scientific backing of whether life begins at conception or at the brainwave or at the heartbeat or at viability, but we know that a child who's passed through the birth canal and is alive and is breathing and can function is a life and should be protected. In fact, one of the most basic human rights is the right to life. The most basic thing we can do as Americans is to protect human life. And yet, when the United States Senate voted on a bill to protect the life of the not fetus, not the preborn or the almost born, we've seen this happen in the last couple of months too. This isn't late-term abortion. We're not seeing that. That's not what we're talking about anymore. We're talking about a child who has been born. When the United States Senate rejects a bill that would protect the life of a child that has been born, the whole game changes. Often in many debates, the slippery slope argument is thrown out. You see, if we start in this place, it's not this place that we're afraid of. It's the slippery slope that will lead to another place. For many, many years, those who are pro-life, who are against abortion, have given ground. Even though many of them would say that life begins at conception and should be protected there, they've given ground along the way based on this belief that as science gets better, as technology gets better, as we are better able to demonstrate when life begins, that we'll all get on the same page, that generally speaking, we all care enough about human life that when we can demonstrate it begins, we'll stop attempting to end those lives. And yet now, we know that that's not the argument. That's not the debate. That's not what we're talking about anymore. The cover has been pulled back, if you will. And what we all clearly see now is that the pro-choice movement is really a pro-abortion movement. A movement with zero interest in when life actually begins. And a movement that would say something like this: what I want is more important than what anyone else wants, even if people, little people, have to die. What a tragic place to live. What it has done is revealed the truth of the argument and put us all in a position where we can finally have an honest debate. Really, this is a debate between the ideals of life and death. And understanding that has put both people, both sides, both philosophies in a position where they can say what they mean and support what they actually believe. And what we see is that the liberal left is scared to death to have a real debate, to the point that senators will stand in front of a mob of those who are pro-abortion and threaten justices of the United States Supreme Court. How all of this ends will be extremely interesting, but I'm thankful we're at the place, finally, after a lot of years, where we see the debate for what it is, and we can move forward with full knowledge of what's at stake.